Hey guys, tonight we're going to walk through thousands of years of human struggle, triumph, and quiet desperation. And somehow, it's going to help you sleep. I know that sounds like a contradiction. How can stories of empires rising and falling, of plagues and wars, and the slow grind of daily survival possibly bring you peace? But here's the thing about history. It's the world's longest, most elaborate bedtime story. Every civilization, every generation, every person who came before us eventually lay down in the dark, closed their eyes, and trusted that tomorrow would somehow take care of itself. So dim the lights now. Settle into your pillows. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of centuries. Feel your shoulders drop, your jaw unclench, your mind prepare for a journey that moves at the speed of geological time. Which is to say, perfectly, sleepily slow. Let me know in the comments what country and city you're watching from, and what time it is right now. Are you tucked in bed in Tokyo at 2 a.m., rain pattering against windows that have seen 1,000 other sleepless nights, wrapped in blankets in Berlin as dawn creeps in like a cautious cat, curled up in Cairo where the same stars that guided ancient caravans are still hanging in the sky? I love knowing you're out there, scattered across time zones like seeds scattered across a field, all seeking the same gentle quiet that humans have been seeking since we first learned to make fire and tell stories around it. We're going to travel, together tonight, you and I, not through space, but through time. We'll visit the first farmers who worried about rain, the first city dwellers who complained about traffic, the first empire builders who discovered that conquest is easier than administration. We'll meet people who lived and died, and loved and worried and lay awake at night, wondering if they were doing any of this right. People who, despite living in worlds so different from ours that they might as well be alien planets, somehow managed to be startlingly, comfortingly, sleepily human. Only if this calms you, only if it helps your mind settle into that soft space between waking and dreaming, consider subscribing. But mostly, just rest. The subscribe button will be there tomorrow. The notifications can wait. Right now, there's just this. Your breath, this voice, and the long, gentle story of how we got from there to here. The ancient Greeks had a word, kairos, for time that feels meaningful rather than measured. Not clock time, but soul time, story time, the kind of time that moves like honey, like river water, like the slow accumulation of dust on temple stones. That's the time we're entering now, not the urgent time of deadlines and alarms, but the patient time of seasons and centuries. So, close your eyes if you want to. Let your thoughts drift like smoke from cooking fires that burned out long ago. Tonight, we're not rushing toward anything. We're not solving anything. We're just remembering. Remembering what it felt like to be human when the world was younger, stranger, and somehow both more dangerous and more magical than the one we know. Are you ready? Good. Take one more deep breath. Let it out slowly. And let's begin this gentle walk through time, where every step takes us further from the urgency of now and deeper into the patient rhythm of always. You wake in the dark, but it's not your dark. This darkness is older, thicker, more complete than anything you've known. There are no streetlights bleeding through curtains, no digital clocks casting blue shadows, no distant hum of highway traffic carrying the restless energy of a world that never quite sleeps. This is the dark that humans knew for most of their existence. Absolute, enveloping, honest dark that doesn't pretend to be anything other than the absence of light. Time feels different here, not like the sharp tick of seconds on a clock, but like cold water rising slowly around your ankles. You're not moving through time so much as sinking into it, the way you might sink into a warm bath after a day that lasted forever. Each breath you take carries you further from the electric urgency of your own century and deeper into something that moves at the speed of stone, of trees, of glaciers carving valleys with infinite patience. You feel it first in your hands. The calluses are different, deeper, harder, shaped by tools that haven't been invented yet or have been forgotten for centuries. Your clothes feel strange against your skin, rougher, heavier, smelling of smoke and wool and the particular mustiness of things that have never been washed in hot water with lavender-scented detergent. The air itself tastes different, cleaner in some ways, but also more dangerous. No exhaust fumes, but also no vaccines, no safety nets, no guarantee that winter won't be the thing that finally wins. But here's what surprises you most. You're still you, still tired, still carrying that particular weight of being human. The way your back aches from work you can't avoid. The way your mind churns through worries that feel both enormous and petty. The way you love people who might not love you back in exactly the way you need them to. The details change across millennia, but the core experience, the beautiful, exhausting, relentless experience of being a conscious creature in an uncertain world, remains remarkably, comfortingly constant. People have been tired for thousands of years. Think about that. Every civilization, every generation, every person who ever lived eventually reached that point in the day when they just couldn't anymore. When the sun went down and they lay down with it, trusting that rest would somehow restore what the day had taken away. Your exhaustion is part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the first human who ever yawned, ever stretched, ever closed their eyes, and hoped for dreams that were kinder than reality. The darkness around you begins to shift, not lighter, but somehow more textured. You can sense shapes, presences, the weight of lives lived and stories told and forgotten and told again. Somewhere in this darkness, a fire is being carefully banked for the night. Somewhere else, a mother is humming a lullaby that has no words because words haven't been invented yet for the things she wants to say. Somewhere, someone is lying awake, worrying about the harvest, about the weather, about whether their children will survive the winter, about all the thousand small and large disasters that might be waiting in tomorrow's shadows. And somehow, this doesn't make you more anxious. It makes you less alone. Your worries, your tiredness, your 3 a.m. fears about whether you're doing any of this right, they're not unique. They're part of a conversation that's been going on since humans first developed the mixed blessing of self-awareness. You're not the first person to lie awake wondering if you matter. You won't be the last. The ground beneath you feels different now. Not the manufactured smoothness of concrete or carpet, but something more organic. Packed earth, maybe, or stone worn smooth by countless feet. You're not just moving through time anymore. You're moving through the accumulated weight of human experience. Every step you take has been taken before, by people whose names are lost, but whose lives somehow led to yours. Your breathing slows to match this older rhythm. In and out, like tides, like seasons, like the slow pulse of geological time. You feel your modern anxiety begin to dissolve, not because the problems go away, but because they take their place in a much longer story. A story where every chapter ends with people somehow finding a way to sleep, to rest, to trust that tomorrow will take care of itself, because it always has. The darkness is complete now, but it's not empty. It's full of presence, of continuity, of the quiet comfort that comes from knowing you're part of something larger than your own brief moment of consciousness. You're ready now, ready to meet the people who came before, to walk in their footsteps, to understand how they found peace in a world that was, in many ways, much harder than yours. And so we begin, not with fanfare, but with the quiet sound of bare feet on ancient stone, with the whisper of stories that have been waiting patiently to be told again. You thought life would be simpler once you stopped running from dinner and started growing it instead. The sun rises on the world's first agricultural hangover. Your back aches from yesterday's harvest. Your hands are stained green from husking grain, and you're beginning to suspect that whoever convinced your great-grandmother to give up the nomadic life might have been overselling the benefits of staying in one place. The gazelles your ancestors used to hunt are still out there, running free across the grasslands. And some mornings, you watch them with something that feels uncomfortably like envy. But then you feel the weight of this season's harvest in your still sore hands, and you remember why your people made this choice. Security, predictability, the radical, almost unimaginable luxury of knowing where your next meal is coming from, or at least where it's supposed to come from, weather and pests, and the mysterious whims of growing things permitting. The settlement wakes around you with the soft sounds of the world's first morning routine. Children emerge from huts rubbing their eyes, looking exactly like children have looked for the past 10,000 years when dragged from sleep before they're ready. Women check the embers from last night's cooking fires, adding dry grass and blowing gently until yesterday's warmth becomes today's first meal. Men stretch and yawn and begin the eternal masculine ritual of examining tools and making small adjustments that may or may not actually improve anything. The smoke from your cooking fire never quite leaves your hair these days. It's become part of you, this constant perfume of wood and char and whatever happened to fall into the flames yesterday. Your clothes, such as they are, carry the same smell. Your children smell like it. Even your dreams taste faintly of smoke, as if the act of staying in one place and maintaining a permanent fire has changed something fundamental about what it means to be human. And maybe it has. Your ancestors moved with the seasons, following the herds, following the rain, never staying long enough in any place to worry about what would happen next year. But you watch the sky now with new eyes. You count seasons. You plan. You save seeds and wonder if next spring will be like this spring, if the rains will come when they're supposed to, if the things you're planting today will feed your children 6 months from now. This is the birth of anxiety as we know it, the peculiar burden of having to think beyond today. Your great-grandfather worried about the hunt. You worry about the harvest. He worried about finding shelter for the night. You worry about whether your permanent shelter will survive the winter. He worried about keeping the group together for the journey. You worry about whether staying together in one place will drive everyone completely insane by the time the crops come in. The walls of your settlement are still low, more symbolic than practical, but they're walls nonetheless. The first human attempt to draw a line between inside and outside, between us and them, between safety and danger. At night, when you're lying on your sleeping mat, listening to the sounds of 30 other people breathing, snoring, shifting, dreaming, their way through another day of this grand experiment in sedentary living, you sometimes wonder what your ancestors would think of these walls. Would they see them as protection, or as the world's first prison? The children adapt faster than the adults, of course. They don't remember the nomadic life, don't carry the genetic memory of horizons that kept changing. To them, this cluster of mud brick huts and carefully tended fields is simply the world. They play in the spaces between buildings, invent games that involve staying in one place instead of always moving toward the next valley, the next water source, the next grazing ground for animals they no longer follow. You watch them sometimes, these children who will never know the particular freedom of owning nothing more than you can carry, and you feel something complex and difficult to name. Loss, maybe, but also hope. They're the first generation of humans who will grow up expecting the world to stay put, expecting tomorrow to happen in the same place as today. The first children who will plant seeds and expect to be there when they grow. Dawn breaks fully now, and the settlement comes alive with the sounds of civilization's first morning commute. The 20-foot walk from sleeping hut to grain storage, from grain storage to grinding stones, from grinding stones to cooking fires. Traffic jams are still a few thousand years away, but the basic principle is already there. everyone trying to get to the same place at the same time. Everyone's slightly annoyed about it, everyone somehow making it work. The rhythm of agricultural life begins to assert itself. Check the fields, tend the fires, mend the tools, prepare the food, store what can be stored, plan for tomorrow, worry about next season, sleep when darkness falls, and hope that morning will bring more of the same blessed, boring, predictable routine that keeps everyone fed and alive and moderately sane. You grind grain between stones, and the repetitive motion becomes meditative, hypnotic. Push and turn, transforming wild seeds into something that can feed a family for a week. Your ancestors would have eaten these seeds raw, grabbed as they moved through the grasslands. You're turning them into bread, into porridge, into the foundation of a food system that will support millions of people who will never have to spend their days searching for their next meal. But walls that keep things out also keep things in, and soon you discover that safety has its own particular weight. The horizon, once infinite and inviting, now ends at the boundary of your fields. The future, once as mysterious and unpredictable as the weather, now depends on decisions you make today about seeds and soil and the careful management of resources that have to last until next harvest. This is how civilization begins, not with grand declarations or heroic conquests, but with the quiet decision to stay in one place long enough to see what grows. The city breathes around you like a sleeping animal. Dawn in arrives with the sound of 1,000 morning routines happening simultaneously. Water being poured, fires being lit, children being coaxed into wakefulness, livestock being fed, tools being gathered for another day of the grand experiment in living too close together. You've been awake for a while, listening to the city wake up layer by layer, wondering when exactly life got so complicated. Your great-grandfather ground grain. You keep track of who owes grain to whom, scratching marks into clay tablets that will outlast empires. The irony isn't lost on you that the most permanent things humans have created so far are records of temporary debts, IOUs that will survive long after the grain has been eaten and the debts forgotten. Future archaeologists will conclude that your civilization was obsessed with bureaucracy, and they won't be entirely wrong. The streets yawn and stretch as the city comes alive. These aren't roads in any sense that future centuries will recognize. More like accidents of geography, spaces left between buildings that multiplied like rabbits when no one was paying attention. Walking through them feels like navigating someone else's fever dream. All narrow passages and unexpected turns and the constant sensation that the city is growing around you even as you move through it. The market stretches awake with the grumpy reluctance of a cat disturbed from a nap, vendors setting up stalls, arranging goods that have traveled impossible distances, calling out prices in voices that carry the particular mix of optimism and resignation that will characterize merchants for the next 5,000 years. Barley from fields you'll never see, fish from rivers that might as well be on the moon, copper from mountains that exist only in stories told by traders who may or may not be telling the truth about anything. You owe grain. You owe labor. You owe prayers to gods who seem to multiply faster than your ability to keep track of their various demands and dietary restrictions. The temple looms over everything, less a building than a man-made mountain, ziggurat steps climbing toward a sky that suddenly feels smaller, more manageable, more like something humans might actually be able to reach if they just stack enough mud bricks in the right order. The priests keep schedules that would exhaust a modern corporate executive. Dawn prayers, midday offerings, evening rituals, midnight consultations with deities who apparently never sleep and have opinions about everything from crop rotation to marriage contracts to the proper way to organize a filing system. Sacred. Prostitutes conduct business with the focused professionalism of accountants, because in a city where everything is connected to everything else, even sex becomes a form of bookkeeping. Holy bookkeeping, sacred accounting, divine administration. You're living in the world's first bureaucracy, And somehow it's also the world's first theocracy. And nobody seems to find this combination as exhausting as you do. The air smells like progress, smoke from forges, incense from temples, sewage from too many people living too close together, bread from ovens that run day and night to feed a population that has grown beyond any reasonable expectation of what a single piece of land should be expected to support. It's the smell of civilization, complex, layered, vaguely overwhelming, and oddly addictive. Children play in the spaces between adult concerns, inventing games that involve dodging donkey carts and avoiding the temple tax collectors and pretending to be merchants selling imaginary goods to imaginary customers who pay in imaginary currency. Their play looks suspiciously like practice for the adult lives they'll inherit, all negotiation and exchange and the careful management of resources that may or may not actually exist. The first traffic jams happen when donkey carts try to navigate streets designed by people who never imagined this much stuff would need to move through them simultaneously. Drivers shout at each other in languages that are still being invented, creating the first multilingual cursing vocabulary. Road rage is born in the same moment as roads, proving that some aspects of human nature are remarkably consistent across millennia. Night falls like a curtain across the world's first proper city, and the change is dramatic. Oil lamps flicker in windows, creating islands of light in darkness that feels deeper and more complete than anything your agricultural ancestors ever experienced. In the countryside, darkness was natural, expected, part of the rhythm of days and seasons. Here, darkness feels like an interruption, a temporary pause in the business of being urban. The temple towers scrape a sky that used to feel infinite, but now seems intimate, manageable, close enough to touch if you could just build high enough, organize efficiently enough, pray hard enough. The gods live up there somewhere, and they apparently have strong opinions about municipal planning, temple architecture, and the proper way to organize a grain storage system. You lie on your sleeping mat, listening to the sounds of thousands of people breathing, snoring, dreaming their way through another day of the grand experiment in urban living. And you wonder what your agricultural ancestors would think of this place. Would they see it as the pinnacle of human achievement, or as a beautiful, elaborate trap? The walls breathe, the floors groan under the weight of too much ambition packed into too small a space. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cries, and the sound echoes off mud brick walls and tile roofs, and the accumulated dreams of people who decided that living alone in the countryside was less interesting than living together in the world's first proper city. The city never quite sleeps, not really. Even in the deepest part of the night, there are sounds. Watchmen walking their rounds, bakers starting the day's bread, priests performing rituals that can't wait for sunrise. The urban pulse, steady and relentless, the heartbeat of civilization, learning to be civilized. And from these crowded streets, where every problem has been solved by creating two new problems, empires begin to dream of more space, more control, more of everything that seems to make sense until you actually try to organize it. You've learned to make forever out of stone and stubbornness. The Nile moves past your window with the lazy confidence of a river that has been doing the same job for so long that it stopped questioning whether there might be better ways to get water from one place to another. Flood, plant, harvest, flood. The rhythm is so reliable that you've built an entire civilization around the assumption that some things, at least, can be counted on to happen the same way tomorrow as they did yesterday. The morning light catches the pyramids in the distance, and you pause in your daily routine to wonder, not for the first time, what your great-grandchildren will think when they see those monuments. Will they remember why you built them? Will they understand that moving 2 million stone blocks into a perfect geometric shape was actually the easy part, and that the real achievement was convincing thousands of people to spend their entire lives working on a project they'd never lived to see completed? Probably not. Future generations have a way of assuming that the people who came before them were either simpler or more complicated than they actually were, never quite managing to hit the middle ground where most human experience actually happens. Your hands are stained with Nile mud this morning, rich as chocolate, persistent as guilt. It gets into everything: your clothes, your food, your dreams. The river gives and takes with the indifference of a god who has better things to worry about than individual human convenience, and you've learned to work with that rhythm rather than against it. Fighting the Nile is like fighting the weather or arguing with mathematics. Theoretically possible, practically exhausting, ultimately pointless. The air is thick with ash and old apologies. Incense from temples, smoke from cooking fires, dust from construction sites where people are building things that are supposed to last forever, but probably won't, at least not in the way they're intended to. The pyramids will endure, certainly, but as monuments to mystery, rather than monuments to the specific dead pharaohs they were built to house. History has a way of changing the meaning of things, whether you want it to or not. Canopic jars sit in rows like ceramic soldiers, waiting to hold the internal organs of people who aren't quite dead yet, but are planning ahead with the thoroughness that only comes from living in a culture obsessed with the afterlife. There's something both touching and absurd about the care that goes into preserving what's already gone. The elaborate rituals designed to maintain the illusion that death is just another kind of travel, requiring different preparations but fundamentally similar to any other journey. The peculiar silence inside a pyramid under construction is unlike anything else in the ancient world. Outside, there's the constant noise of human activity: shouting, hammering, the creak of ropes, and the thud of stone settling into place. Inside, there's only the echo of your own footsteps and the weight of all those blocks pressing down, creating a silence so complete it feels like being inside a prayer that hasn't been spoken yet. You walk through corridors that will be sealed forever once the pharaoh dies, and you wonder if anyone has considered the psychological impact of spending your working life building elaborate tombs. Does it make death feel more familiar, more manageable? Or does it make life feel more precious? By comparison, you suspect the answer depends on what mood you're in when you ask the question. Stone by stone, the pyramid grows. Block by block, the illusion of permanence takes shape. Each stone is carefully cut, carefully placed, carefully secured against the possibility of earthquake, erosion, or simple gravity. But no one is planning for tomb robbers, for changing religious fashions, for the possibility that future generations might see these monuments as tourist attractions rather than sacred sites. The pharaohs promised eternal life, and in a way, they got it. They're still here, aren't they? Still lying in the dark, still waiting for visitors, still drawing crowds. Death as the ultimate career move, the final promotion to a position where your job security is measured in millennia rather than years. Still better than the employment prospects in most of the ancient world. Daily prayers sound like shopping lists. Grant us flood, grant us harvest, grant us another year of the same blessed routine that keeps everyone fed and reasonably happy, and not thinking too hard about what happens when the Nile decides to change course, or the pharaoh decides to build an even bigger pyramid, or the gods decide they're tired of the same old offerings and want something more interesting. River rhythms pulse through everything: flood, plant, harvest, flood. The predictability is both comforting and slightly maddening. Your ancestors lived with uncertainty, followed the herds, never knew what tomorrow would bring. You live with certainty, follow the calendar, know exactly what next month will bring, and the month after that, and the month after that, stretching into a future that looks remarkably like the past. The walls breathe with the slow exhalation of stone settling into place. The floors groan under the weight of ambition, measured in tons rather than dreams. Somewhere in the royal workshops, craftsmen are creating art that will survive longer than the language it was created in. Objects of beauty that will outlast. the civilization that considered them everyday household items. Linen wrappings wait in neat piles, ready to transform the dead into tidy, portable packages that can be stored indefinitely without offending anyone's sensibilities. Mummification as the ultimate form of recycling, turning what would otherwise be a disposal problem into a preservation opportunity. The Egyptians approach death with the same methodical thoroughness they bring to flood management, tax collection, and pyramid construction. Night falls over the Nile Delta, and the river continues its eternal conversation with the sand, the reed beds, the carefully maintained irrigation channels that turn desert into farmland through the simple expedient of moving water from where it is to where it's needed. Tomorrow will bring the same routine. Tend the fields, work on the pyramid, pray to gods who seem to prefer their worship expressed in tons of carefully arranged stone. The pyramids stand in the distance like geometric mountains, monuments to the idea that death doesn't have to be the end of the story if you're willing to invest enough time, money, and limestone in the alternative. They catch the starlight and hold it, creating shadows that will fall across the desert long after the civilization that built them has become just another chapter in someone else's history book. But not every civilization builds for forever. Some prefer to burn bright and brief, to create beauty that lives in memory rather than stone, to leave behind ideas rather than monuments. You've invented democracy, philosophy, and theatre, and you're still arguing about everything. The morning light slants through olive groves with the golden intensity that only exists in places where the gods supposedly used to live. And you're beginning to understand why your ancestors thought immortal beings might choose to spend eternity here. The air smells like wild herbs and possibility, like a world where every question might have an answer if you just think about it hard enough and argue about it long enough and drink enough wine while doing both. Your symposium last night lasted until dawn, and your head feels like it's been used as a percussion instrument by very enthusiastic but not particularly skilled musicians. 3 days of debate about the nature of justice, the definition of virtue, and whether Socrates was being genuinely wise or just professionally annoying, and you're no closer to consensus than when you started. But somehow, this doesn't feel like failure. It feels like the most human thing you've ever done. Olive oil lamps flicker in the academy, casting dancing shadows on walls where the greatest minds of your generation gather to ask questions that don't have easy answers. Or maybe, don't have answers at all. The lamp oil smells like civilization, complex, processed, requiring cultivation and patience, and the kind of long-term thinking that separates humans from every other species that ever figured out how to make fire. The specific exhaustion of a 3-day philosophical marathon settles into your bones like wine settling into amphorae. Your brain feels both expanded and depleted, stretched to accommodate ideas that seemed simple when you started, but revealed their complexity the moment you tried to examine them closely. What is justice? What is beauty? What is the good life? These seemed like reasonable questions until you realized that every answer generates 3 new questions, and every new question reveals assumptions you didn't know you were making. Marble. Columns stand against the sky like frozen arguments. Geometric proof that beauty and mathematics are somehow the same thing expressed in different languages. The stone is cold even in summer heat, as if it's holding on to some essential coolness that exists independent of weather, season, or the particular temperature of the day you happen to be experiencing it. The sound of democracy fills the agora. Hundreds of voices trying to agree on anything. The beautiful, exhausting cacophony of people who have decided that important decisions should be made by everyone rather than by someone who claims to know better than everyone else. It's messier than monarchy, less efficient than dictatorship, more expensive than anarchy, and somehow more satisfying than any of the alternatives you've tried so far. Citizens argue about taxes with the passion that future generations will reserve for sports teams or religious doctrine. The vote on harbour improvements becomes a 3-hour debate about the nature of civic responsibility, the proper role of government, and whether Pericles' proposal for funding public art is a wise investment in cultural development or an expensive vanity project designed to make him look good to voters who care more about pretty buildings than practical infrastructure. You cast your pottery shard into the voting urn, and the small ceramic clink sounds like the heartbeat of a civilization that has decided to trust collective wisdom over individual authority. Ostracism as democratic pest control, the annual opportunity to exile whoever has become too annoying, too powerful, or too successful for the community's comfort. It's brutal and brilliant and completely impractical, and somehow it works most of the time. Theatre masks hang on workshop walls like the faces of emotions that are too large for any single human to contain. Comedy and tragedy, the two fundamental modes of human experience, frozen in ceramic expressions that will outlast the actors who wore them, the audiences who watched them, the stories that gave them meaning. Drama as democracy in action, the collective exploration of questions that can't be answered individually. Wine tastes like philosophy here, complex, layered, improving with age and contemplation, requiring sophisticated palates and patient appreciation. The symposium cup passes from hand to hand, and each person adds their thoughts to the evening's conversation, the way musicians add notes to a melody that belongs to everyone and no one. Students gather in the gymnasium, exercising bodies and minds with equal intensity, because your culture has somehow figured out that physical fitness and intellectual development are connected in ways that future civilizations will forget, and then rediscover every few centuries. Wrestling and rhetoric, running and reasoning, the harmony of a culture that sees no contradiction between being strong and being thoughtful. The library at Alexandria grows daily, scroll by scroll, as if someone has decided to collect all human knowledge in one place and see what happens when you put it all together. Scholars copy texts with the devotion of priests, preserving ideas that will survive the collapse of the civilization that created them, carrying wisdom forward through centuries that will sometimes seem hostile to the very concept of wisdom. Socrates knew nothing, and he knew that he knew nothing, which somehow made him wiser than people who thought they knew everything. Plato wrote it all down, turning conversation into literature, questions into philosophy, uncertainty into a method for approaching truth. Aristotle organized it, categorized it, created systems for thinking about thinking that will influence human consciousness for the next 2,000 years. And you're still confused, but it's a different kind of confusion now. Not the confusion of ignorance, but the confusion of people who have looked closely enough at reality to see how mysterious it actually is. The oracle at Delphi says, "Know thyself," and you're beginning to suspect that this might be the most difficult and important assignment anyone has ever given you. Mathematical proofs scratch across wax tablets like prayers written in numbers, geometric demonstrations that reality follows rules that can be discovered, understood, taught, and trusted. The Pythagorean theorem isn't just true in Athens, it's true everywhere, for everyone, always. The first universal language spoken in right angles and perfect circles. Night falls over the Parthenon, and the temple catches starlight like a net, designed to hold beauty until future generations can figure out what to do with it. The columns create shadows that fall across marble steps, worn smooth by the feet of people who came to ask the gods for wisdom, for justice, for victory in war, for success in love, for all the things that humans have always wanted and will always want, whether they live in Athens or anywhere else. Time and human longing intersect. Still better than the barley gruel they serve in Sparta, you think, and immediately feel guilty for the thought, because Spartan simplicity has its own kind of beauty, its own kind of wisdom. But not tonight. Tonight, complexity feels like the most honest response to a world that reveals new layers of mystery every time you think you've figured it out. But Greek fire eventually burns out. and the torch passes to hands that prefer building roads to building arguments, administration to contemplation, empire to democracy. The world suddenly has an address, and it's Rome. You wake to the sound of hobnailed boots on stone, the rhythmic percussion that means the legions are moving through the city before dawn, heading out to extend the borders of civilization to places that don't yet know they want to be civilized. The echo bounces off aqueduct arches and temple walls and apartment buildings that rise higher than any structures have a right to rise, creating an urban symphony that sounds like confidence made audible. Water flows past your window in channels, carved from stone and ambition, carrying the taste of infrastructure from mountains you'll never see to fountains you use every day, without thinking about the engineering miracle that brings fresh water into the heart of a city that supports more people than most countries. Aqueduct water tastes like empire, clean, reliable, slightly metallic, flavored with the particular satisfaction that comes from making the impossible seem routine. The forum buzzes with the energy of people who have figured out how to turn conquest into administration, war into paperwork, tribal loyalty into imperial citizenship. Citizens check the daily news posted on walls like ancient social media, reading updates about provincial governors, trade regulations, military campaigns, and gladiator schedules, with the casual interest of people who live at the center of the world and expect to be kept informed about everything that happens at the edges. Bathhouses steam with the conversations of empire, where naked senators debate tax policy with naked merchants, where naked generals plan campaigns with naked philosophers, where the business of ruling the world gets conducted in naked honesty. Democracy by hot water, diplomacy by steam room, the peculiar Roman innovation of making important decisions while everyone involved is clean, relaxed, and unable to hide weapons in their clothing. Wine travels further than most people ever will, arriving in Rome from vineyards in Gaul, Spain, Egypt, carrying the taste of distant places that are somehow all part of the same vast political entity. You drink wine from grapes that grew under foreign skies, pressed by hands that speak different languages, but all pay taxes to the same emperor. All live under the same legal system. All participate in the same grand experiment in organized multiculturalism. Morning. Routine in Rome feels like empire in miniature. Wake up, check the household accounts, written in numerals that work the same way in Britain and Egypt. Review the slave schedules, people from a dozen provinces, speaking a dozen languages, all learning Latin because it's the language of advancement. Plan the day's activities. Shopping in markets that sell goods from continents most people can't locate on maps that may or may not exist. The Colosseum fills with the roar of people who cheer for death and then go home to dinner. The strange Roman appetite for spectacle that turns violence into entertainment, citizenship into spectatorship. Gladiators die with the professional competence of people who have turned mortality into a career choice, while crowds consume death the way they consume wine, bread, and the daily satisfaction of living at the center of the world. Legal documents multiply like rabbits in a bureaucracy that has discovered the intoxicating power of writing everything down. Contracts, wills, property deeds, citizenship papers, tax assessments, military commissions. The administrative poetry of conquest, where every relationship gets reduced to terms and conditions that can be enforced by people who may never have met the parties involved, but understand the universal language of properly filed paperwork. Roads stretch in perfectly straight lines toward horizons that keep expanding, carrying not just armies and merchants, but the more subtle cargo of Roman assumptions about how civilized people should organize their lives. Stone by stone, mile by mile, the empire builds infrastructure that will outlast the empire itself, creating a transportation network so efficient that future civilizations will spend centuries trying to figure out how the Romans made concrete that actually got stronger with age. The Campus Martius echoes with the sounds of young men learning to be soldiers. the rhythmic drill of future legionnaires practicing the specific skills that turn individual fighters into an unstoppable military machine. March in formation, build a camp, dig a ditch, build a wall, tear it down, march somewhere else. Repeat until you've conquered everything worth conquering and some things that probably weren't but seemed like good ideas at the time. Slaves from every corner of the known world work alongside each other in Roman households, creating a multicultural workforce that speaks the empire's diversity in a dozen accents. Greek tutors, Germanic bodyguards, Egyptian accountants, British miners, Spanish cooks, the human inventory of a civilization that has figured out how to turn conquest into a recruitment strategy. You're just one person, but you're Roman, which somehow makes you everyone. The citizenship you carry isn't just legal status. It's membership in a club that spans continents, speaks the same legal language from Scotland to Syria, worships the same gods from Britain to Egypt, and shares the same confidence that organization can solve most problems and military force can solve the rest. Senate debates echo through marble halls, where the descendants of farmers argue about the proper way to govern an empire that grows faster than anyone's ability to understand it. Provincial administration, trade policy, military budgets, infrastructure development. The endless, necessary, slightly boring work of turning conquest into civilization, victory into bureaucracy, expansion into the kind of stable, predictable routine that lets people plan for tomorrow. Temple incense mingles with the smoke from cooking fires, creating an atmosphere that smells like religious diversity managed by administrative efficiency. Roman gods, Greek gods, Egyptian gods, Persian gods, all welcome as long as they don't interfere with tax collection, military service, or the emperor's birthday celebrations. Theological tolerance as imperial policy, the practical decision that people can worship whoever they want as long as they also worship Rome. Amphitheater crowds consume spectacle with the enthusiasm of people who live in a civilization that has turned entertainment into an art form. Chariot races, gladiator games, theatrical performances, public executions, all part of the Roman innovation of keeping citizens happy by giving them increasingly elaborate distractions from the serious business of empire maintenance. Night falls over the 7 hills, and the city transforms into something that glows with oil lamps and torches, creating pools of light connected by networks of shadow that pulse with the nocturnal rhythms of a metropolis that never quite sleeps. Watchmen patrol streets that are safer than they have any right to be, given the number of people, cultures, languages, and competing interests packed into a space that would have seemed impossibly crowded to previous civilizations. The efficiency feels like caring somehow. Not personal caring, Rome is too big for that, but systematic caring, institutional caring, the kind of caring that builds hospitals and schools and law courts, because organized societies need these things to function properly. You matter to Rome not as an individual, but as a citizen, a taxpayer, a participant in the grand project of keeping civilization civilized. Aqueducts carry water through the darkness, a liquid lifeline that connects the city to distant mountains, distant sources, distant possibilities. The engineering is so reliable that most people don't think about it, the way people in functioning societies don't think about the infrastructure that makes their lives possible, until something breaks down and reminds them how much they depend on systems they don't understand. But even Rome discovers that forever is a promise no one can keep, that expansion has limits, that the energy required to maintain an empire eventually exceeds the energy generated by expanding it. The aqueducts still work, but nobody remembers how to fix them. Morning light filters through cracks in the Colosseum's walls, illuminating empty seats that once held the roar of crowds who believed that Rome would last forever because it was too big, too organized, too successful to imagine any other possibility. The silence has weight now. The particular heaviness of spaces designed for noise, for spectacle, for the confident energy of people who expected tomorrow to be pretty much like today, only maybe slightly more prosperous. Grass grows between forum stones with the patience of vegetation that understands geological time better than humans understand political time. Each blade pushes through joints in masonry that were cut and fitted by craftsmen who learned their trade from craftsmen who learned their trade from craftsmen who never imagined that anyone would ever need to remember how Roman concrete was actually made. Libraries smell like ending. The particular mustiness of scrolls that crumble faster than they can be copied by scribes who cost more than most people earn in a year. Knowledge becomes expensive when the infrastructure that supported it starts to decay, when the schools that trained the teachers close for lack of funding, when the roads that connected libraries to each other become too dangerous for scholars to travel. Wine tastes like nostalgia and unpaid bills, vintage bottles stored in cellars of villas that their owners can't afford to maintain but can't bear to abandon. The grapes were grown in provinces that may or may not still consider themselves part of the empire, pressed by hands that may or may not still pay taxes to an emperor, who may or may not still have the authority to collect them. Border guards patrol frontiers that shrink like puddles in summer, pulling back from territories that cost more to defend than they generate in revenue, abandoning fortifications that took generations to build and will take decades to crumble into ruins that future archaeologists will misinterpret in creative and interesting ways. Taxes rise like floodwater, reaching levels that would have seemed impossible during the expansion years, when conquest paid for itself and imperial growth generated the wealth needed to fund more imperial growth. But maintenance costs more than expansion, and preservation requires different skills than acquisition. And nobody in the administrative chain seems to have anticipated that empires might need to shrink as carefully as they grow. Gods multiply like desperate prayers, foreign, deities imported from every corner of the empire as people search for spiritual solutions to political problems, mystery cults, philosophical schools, religious movements that promise personal salvation when collective salvation starts to seem unlikely. The theological marketplace of a civilization that has lost confidence in its traditional sources of meaning. Senate debates echo through marble halls, where fewer and fewer people show up to argue about policies that affect fewer and fewer people in meaningful ways. Provincial administration becomes a theoretical exercise when provinces declare independence, ignore imperial decrees, or simply stop responding to letters from Rome altogether. The barbarians at the gate turn out to be everyone who wasn't invited to the party, which, it turns out, was most people. Goths, Vandals, Huns, Franks, tribal names that sound like bad weather, like natural disasters, like forces of nature that civilized people should be able to control, but somehow can't. They're not trying to destroy Rome, so much as they're trying to become Rome, to participate in the prosperity and security that empire promised, but couldn't deliver to everyone who wanted it. Military recruitment becomes increasingly difficult. When young Romans prefer careers that don't involve marching to distant frontiers to fight people who seem to multiply faster than they can be defeated, the legions fill with foreign mercenaries who fight for Rome without necessarily caring about Rome. Soldiers whose loyalty lasts exactly as long as their paychecks, and whose paychecks arrive less and less regularly. Administrative efficiency collapses under the weight of its own complexity. Bureaucratic systems that worked smoothly when the empire was growing but become impossibly cumbersome when the empire starts contracting. Forms that require signatures from officials who no longer exist. Taxes collected for purposes that are no longer relevant. Laws enforced by courts that lack the authority to enforce anything more serious than parking violations. Empty seats in the Colosseum fill with weeds that don't care about gladiator schedules, entertainment budgets, or the popular demand for increasingly elaborate spectacles. The crowds have found other amusements, other distractions, other ways to avoid thinking about the serious business of imperial maintenance, which has become too expensive and too complicated for anyone to manage effectively. Urban decay spreads through neighborhoods that once housed the middle classes who made empire possible. Merchants, craftsmen, administrators, teachers, all the people who turned conquest into civilization and are now discovering that civilization requires constant maintenance that conquest doesn't automatically provide. Night watchmen patrol darker streets, carrying torches that illuminate smaller and smaller circles of safety, in a city that feels increasingly hollow, increasingly temporary, increasingly like a stage set for a play that ended years ago, but nobody bothered to tell the actors they could go home. Aqueduct maintenance falls behind schedule, then falls behind possibility, then gets abandoned altogether as the engineering expertise needed to maintain Roman water systems emigrates to places that can afford to pay for Roman quality. Infrastructure, the water still flows, but more slowly, less reliably, carrying the taste of deferred maintenance and institutional amnesia. Libraries close not because books become illegal, but because books become luxury items that fewer and fewer people can afford to buy, copy, or store in buildings that cost more to heat than most communities spend on education. Knowledge concentrates in monasteries and private collections, preserved by people who understand that intellectual continuity requires more than good intentions. Empires don't fall, you realize, watching grass grow through forum stones and weeds colonize amphitheater seats. They just get tired and sit down. The infrastructure remains, the knowledge survives in fragments, the organizational principles influence future civilizations, but the energy that made it all work dissipates like heat from cooling metal. The sun sets over Rome with the same golden light that witnessed the city's rise, indifferent to human ambitions that seemed permanent when they were growing and seem inevitable when they're declining. Tomorrow will bring more of the same gentle entropy, more grass between stones, more silence in spaces designed for noise, more evidence that all human achievements are temporary, but some are temporary in more interesting ways than others. And, from Rome's exhausted stones, something smaller, stranger, and more persistent begins to grow. Communities that organize around different principles, different assumptions about what civilization should try to accomplish. They call them the Dark Ages, but someone still had to feed the chickens. Dawn breaks over a world that has learned to think smaller, to expect less, to find meaning in the space between one sunrise and the next, rather than in grand plans that span generations. The monastery bell marks time in a world that has forgotten clocks, forgotten the Roman obsession with precise schedules, forgotten that time can be anything other than the rhythm of prayers, meals, work, and sleep repeated until death, or the second coming, whichever arrives first. Vellum costs more than most people earn in a year, making books precious objects that require special ceremonies just to open, special prayers just to read, special rituals just to turn the pages without damaging material that represents months of careful preparation. Calfskin stretched and scraped and bleached into writing surfaces that will outlast the empires whose stories they preserve, whose languages they maintain, whose ideas they carry forward through centuries that will sometimes seem hostile to the very concept of learning. Candlelight illuminates manuscripts where angels dance in margins designed by monks who never saw Rome, but somehow understand that beauty matters even when, especially when, the world feels like it's ending. Each letter drawn by hand, each word copied with the devotion of people who believe that preserving knowledge is a form of prayer, that maintaining literacy is a form of resistance against the entropy that turns civilizations into archaeological sites. The specific smell of a world without soap permeates everything. Not dirty, exactly, but organic, immediate, honest about the realities of human existence in ways that more sophisticated civilizations prefer to disguise with perfumes, cosmetics, and elaborate plumbing systems that separate people from the biological facts of being alive in bodies that require constant maintenance. Feudal contracts, written in mud and hope, bind people together in relationships that replace the abstract. citizenship of empire with the personal loyalty of individuals who know each other's names, family histories, and probable reactions to most foreseeable crises. You owe service to someone who owes service to someone else, creating chains of obligation that stretch up toward kings and down toward serfs in networks of mutual dependence that work better than they should in theory. Monastery life follows. Schedules that make Roman administrative efficiency look haphazard. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. The canonical hours that divide each day into segments of prayer, work, study, and contemplation. Dawn prayers that sound like administrative meetings with God, complete with agendas, specific requests, and follow-up appointments scheduled for the same time next day. Copying texts, letter by letter, because printing is still 500 years away. And anyway, hand copying ensures that each book gets the individual attention it deserves, the personal relationship between scribe and text that mass production can't provide. Mistakes creep in, variations accumulate, but also insights, marginalia, connections between ideas that only become visible when you spend months thinking about every word. Village life organizes around problems that can be solved by people working together. Harvest, defense, weather. The 1,000 small crises that require community response rather than imperial intervention. You survive by making everything smaller until it fits. Smaller governments, smaller economies, smaller expectations, smaller ambitions that can be achieved by people who know each other personally. Trade happens, but moves slowly, carries news, along with goods, creates networks of connection that span continents, but move at walking speed. A merchant from Byzantium brings silk and stories, spices and gossip, luxury items and information that travels from marketplace to marketplace, like seeds carried by wind, some taking root, some forgotten, all contributing to the slow circulation of ideas that keep civilization alive even when political structures collapse. Local lords administer justice under trees, in village squares, wherever people can gather to witness decisions that affect their daily lives. Law becomes personal again, based on relationships, reputation, community knowledge, rather than abstract. Legal codes administered by professional judges, who may never have visited the places where their decisions take effect. Agricultural innovation happens in fields and workshops, where people who can't read Roman technical manuals reinvent techniques that work in their particular soil, their particular climate, their particular social conditions. The heavy plow, crop rotation, windmills, water mills, technologies that emerge from local problem solving rather than imperial research programs. Oral tradition carries stories, songs, histories, technical knowledge through generations of people who may not be able to write but can remember accurately, creatively, persistently. Memory as technology, storytelling as database management, community gathered around fires where information gets preserved in forms that books can't match for emotional impact and cultural transmission. Christian missionaries travel roads that Romans built but can no longer maintain, carrying new ideas about individual worth, community responsibility, eternal meaning to peoples who are trying to figure out how to live meaningful lives in the wreckage of imperial ambitions. Conversion happens slowly, partially, creatively, producing forms of Christianity that Roman theologians might not recognize, but that work for communities with different needs than urban intellectuals. Illuminated manuscripts bloom with colors that seem impossibly bright in a world of brown bread, greystone, and muddy roads. Gold leaf applied with brushes made from single animal hairs. Pigments ground from minerals that cost more than farmland. Artistic production that concentrates enormous resources on individual objects designed to last forever and inspire awe in viewers who may see few beautiful things in their entire lives. Castle construction begins as practical defense but becomes symbolic architecture. Visible statements about power, permanence, and the human ability to build something that might survive the next invasion, the next famine, the next collapse of whatever political arrangements currently seem stable. Stone walls that protect not just people, but also the idea that protection is possible, that some things can be preserved against the entropy that turns empires into ruins. Night falls across Europe with darkness that feels complete, honest, uncompromised, by urban lighting or the restless energy of civilizations that never sleep. Stars, visible in ways that will become impossible once people rediscover streetlights, city planning, and the peculiar modern conviction that darkness is a problem to be solved rather than a natural condition to be accepted. Village communities gather around fires that provide light, heat, and the social focus that makes individual survival possible in a world that has become too large and dangerous for individuals to navigate alone. Stories told, songs sung, decisions made, relationships negotiated in the democracy of shared warmth and shared vulnerability. But isolation has its limits, and soon the world starts calling again, not with the voice of empire demanding tribute, but with the voice of curiosity, wondering what lies beyond the next valley, the next forest, the next horizon. While Europe argues about angels and pins, you're translating the universe into Arabic. The House of Wisdom wakes before dawn with the rustle of paper and parchment, the whispered conversations of scholars who speak Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Arabic with equal fluency, comparing translations of Aristotle with commentaries by philosophers whose names European libraries have never heard. Knowledge flows like water finding its level, pooling in Baghdad where intellectual curiosity matters more than the ethnic background of the people asking questions. Astrolabe measurements taken under stars that speak in mathematics, geometric precision that works the same way whether you're calculating prayer times in Cordoba or navigation routes across the Indian Ocean. The sky becomes a library written in light, readable by anyone who learns the universal grammar of angles, coordinates, and the patient observation of celestial mechanics that don't change based on who's watching them. Paper mills hum with the sound of progress, Chinese technology adapted for Arabic script, creating writing surfaces cheap enough that scholars can afford to make mistakes, experiment with ideas, write rough drafts that might lead to insights that might change how people understand the relationship between mathematics and reality. Knowledge becomes affordable when paper costs less than vellum, when books multiply faster than scribes can copy them by hand. Medical schools operate by candlelight and prayer, but also by systematic observation, careful record keeping, and the radical assumption that human bodies work according to principles that can be discovered, understood, and applied consistently. Surgery happens with instruments that look suspiciously like precision engineering, in hospitals that organize patient care with administrative efficiency that would impress Roman bureaucrats. Algebra emerges as the first universal language, symbolic logic that works the same way in Cairo and Constantinople, mathematical relationships that remain constant, whether you're calculating tax revenues or architectural proportions, or the optimal trajectory for water flowing through irrigation, systems that turn desert into garden through the patient application of geometric principles. Translation workshops buzz with conversations between scholars who argue about the precise meaning of Greek philosophical terms in Arabic, Persian poetic, concepts in mathematical notation, Sanskrit medical procedures in languages that were never designed to carry such technical precision. Ideas cross linguistic boundaries the way merchants cross political boundaries, carefully, creatively, profitably. Maps show the Earth as round while European cartographers insist it's flat. Geographical knowledge based on the reports of travelers who have actually been to the places they're describing, rather than on theological assumptions about what the world should look like, according to religious authorities who may never have travelled beyond the boundaries of their own kingdoms. Chemistry labs that look suspiciously like wizard towers produce practical results. Better medicines, improved metallurgy, more efficient manufacturing processes, and the gradual understanding that matter behaves according to discoverable laws rather than arbitrary supernatural intervention. Alchemy slowly transforms into chemistry through the patient accumulation of experiments that work, procedures that can be repeated, observations that generate predictable results. Library catalogues grow longer than some European books, systematic bibliographies that organize human knowledge according to subjects, authors, and cross-references that make it possible for scholars to find information quickly, efficiently, without having to memorize the entire contents of their civilization's intellectual heritage. Information management as intellectual technology, filing systems that turn individual books into components of larger knowledge networks. Observatory calculations track planetary movements with precision that won't be matched in Europe for centuries. Astronomical tables that enable accurate calendar systems, navigation techniques, and the gradual realization that the universe operates according to mathematical principles rather than the arbitrary decisions of gods who change their minds about physics depending on their moods. Agricultural innovation transforms landscapes through irrigation engineering that moves water uphill, crop rotation systems that maintain soil fertility, and botanical experiments that adapt plants from different climates to local growing conditions. Desert reclamation as applied mathematics, turning theoretical geometry into practical agriculture that feeds cities, supports scholarship, and generates the prosperity that makes intellectual life possible. Trade networks carry ideas along with goods, creating circulation systems that connect minds in Baghdad with minds in Cordoba, scholars in Cairo with scholars in Samarkand. Intellectual exchange as commercial activity, knowledge as cargo that travels along routes established for silk and spices, but carrying the more valuable freight of insights, techniques, and questions that generate new questions. Hospitals organize medical care with administrative sophistication that includes separate wards for different conditions, training programs for physicians and nurses, systematic record keeping that tracks treatment outcomes, and the revolutionary assumption that healing should be available to patients regardless of their ability to pay for services. Public health as civic responsibility, medicine as social service rather than private transaction. Philosophical debates blend Aristotelian logic with Islamic theology, producing synthetic systems of thought that influence European scholasticism, Jewish philosophy, and the gradual development of scientific method. Reason and faith negotiating the boundaries of their respective territories, creating intellectual frameworks that can accommodate both empirical observation and spiritual conviction. You're preserving European knowledge better than the Europeans, maintaining libraries while European monasteries struggle with basic literacy, developing mathematical techniques while European scholars argue about the theological implications of using Arabic numerals. The irony escapes no one who thinks about it, but most people are too busy learning to worry about the cultural politics of intellectual preservation. Architectural engineering produces buildings that seem to defy gravity, arches that span impossible distances, domes that float like geometric prayers, decorative patterns that turn mathematics into visual poetry. Sacred geometry made physical, spaces designed to inspire both intellectual and spiritual contemplation through the careful application of proportional relationships that work as well for engineers as for mystics. Night falls across the Islamic world with the call to prayer echoing from minarets that serve as both religious architecture and astronomical instruments. Towers positioned according to calculations that enable accurate determination of prayer times, calendar dates, and the geographical relationships between distant communities that share theological commitments but may never meet physically. Scientific instruments multiply in workshops where craftsmen collaborate with scholars to produce tools that extend human sensory capabilities. Better telescopes, more accurate astrolabes, precision scales that enable chemical analysis, optical devices that reveal previously invisible natural phenomena, technology as applied curiosity, engineering as the practical expression of theoretical insights. But golden ages tarnish. and soon the torch passes again, this time to hands that prefer building cathedrals to calculating stars, preserving faith, to expanding knowledge, creating beauty that points toward heaven rather than understanding that maps the measurable universe. The flame of systematic inquiry flickers but doesn't die, carrying forward through manuscripts, through students who become teachers, through institutions that outlast the political arrangements that created them, waiting for future civilizations that will rediscover the pleasure of asking questions that lead to more questions. You're building heaven with your hands while standing in mud. The cathedral rises around you like a prayer made of stone, each block carved by calloused fingers that shake from cold and devotion in equal measure. Dawn breaks grey through scaffolding that's been here longer than most lifetimes, and you climb toward God, one wooden rung at a time. The bells call you to prayer. Before sunrise, their bronze voices rolling across fields where peasants bend like question marks over furrows that smell of manure and hope. You join the procession of shuffling feet on stone floors, worn smooth by millions of genuflections, your breath visible in air that tastes of incense and unwashed wool. The chant begins before you're fully awake, Latin words flowing like water, finding its level, voices blending until individual suffering becomes communal song. Gregorian melodies wrap around your ribs and settle there, making even breathing feel sacred. The notes rise and fall with mathematical precision that would make the Baghdad astronomers proud. Each phrase calculated to lift hearts toward heaven while keeping feet firmly planted in European mud. You sing without understanding all the words, but understanding arrives through repetition, through the way certain syllables catch in your throat like hooks pulling you upward. The scriptorium smells of vellum and gold leaf, where Brother Benedict copies Aristotle while whispering Hail Marys, preserving pagan wisdom with Christian prayers. His fingers are stained blue from lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan. Each illuminated letter, a tiny cathedral where angels dance in margins and monsters lurk between verses. He works by candlelight that flickers like his faith, sometimes bright, sometimes wavering, but never quite going out. The cathedral construction spans generations like some impossible relay race where the baton is made of stone and mortar. Children who mix lime mortar die as grandparents who never see the spires completed, but somehow the work continues. Master builders pass down secrets in whispered consultations, angles and arches calculated by men who learned geometry from light, streaming through colored glass. You're part of something larger than your lifetime, building forever out of limestone and stubbornness. Stained glass windows transform ordinary sunlight into stories that can't be read, but only felt. Light becomes narrative as it passes through panels showing martyrdoms and miracles, casting colored shadows on faces upturned in worship that look suspiciously like wonder. The glass costs more than most villages earn in a decade, but beauty, it turns out, feeds souls that bread cannot reach. Purple light falls across your hands folded in prayer, and for a moment, you understand why they call this transubstantiation. The pilgrimage roads stretch like veins across Europe, worn smooth by millions of hopeful feet, carrying blisters and prayers in equal measure. Santiago de Compostela draws pilgrims like a magnet, draws iron filings, pulling merchants and mystics and criminals seeking redemption across mountains that care nothing for human devotion. You walk because walking is prayer made visible, each step a small act of faith that the road leads somewhere worth reaching. Monasteries dot the landscape like lighthouses in a sea of ignorance, preserving knowledge in scriptoriums where monks copy everything from Plato to recipes for soap. They maintain libraries while Europe forgets how to read, keeping civilization alive in cells that smell of vellum and dedication. The rule of Saint Benedict divides time into prayer and work with mathematical precision, creating order from the chaos of collapsed empires through the simple revolutionary idea that every hour should serve some purpose. The feudal system builds hierarchy like a cathedral in reverse. each layer supporting the one above through oaths sworn on relics that may or may not be authentic. You swear fealty to lords who swear fealty to kings, who swear fealty to God, creating chains of obligation that bind everyone to everyone else through promises that sound better in ceremony than in practice. But somehow, this web of mutual dependence creates stability, small pockets of peace where crops grow and children survive to become adults who build more cathedrals. Saints perform miracles that look suspiciously like coincidences, healing sick children and stopping plagues through interventions that might be divine or might be the medieval equivalent of washing your hands. But miracles, real or imagined, provide hope to people whose lives are otherwise composed of mud, hunger, and early death. The possibility of intervention from above makes earthly suffering bearable, transforming pain into prayer and prayer into something approaching peace. You're so focused on the next world that you accidentally improve this one. Hospitals grow beside monasteries, universities beside cathedrals, legal systems beside canon law. The pursuit of heavenly perfection creates earthly progress through the simple insistence that human life should aspire to something higher than mere survival. Love of God becomes love of learning, love of beauty, love of justice, though these connections won't be fully recognized for centuries. The Black Plague arrives like God's own editor, removing half the population and leaving the survivors to wonder what rough draft they've been living in. But faith, tested by mass graves and prayers that seem to bounce off heaven's closed doors, somehow endures. The cathedral construction continues even as workers die faster than they can be replaced, because some forms of hope are too stubborn for even death to kill completely. God wants you to travel 3,000 miles to kill people you've never met, for reasons that sound better in Latin than in any language you actually speak. Pope Urban II's words echo in cathedrals across Europe like stones thrown into still water, each ripple creating new waves of religious enthusiasm, mixed with wanderlust and the age-old human desire to solve spiritual problems through violence. The cross sewn onto your tunic feels heavier than the sword at your side, as you join the streams of pilgrims flowing toward Constantinople, like tributaries feeding a river of faith and ambition. Peasants walk beside knights, merchants beside monks, all united by the revolutionary idea that war can be prayer made manifest. Your feet find rhythm on roads worn smooth by Roman legions, who conquered these same lands for entirely different gods centuries ago. Ships sink more often than they arrive, Mediterranean storms carrying nothing for holy missions or sacred vows. Those that reach the Holy Land carry cargoes of seasick warriors whose armor has turned to rust during months at sea, whose horses have died of thirst and stress, whose faith has been tested by storms that make God seem very far away indeed. You arrive diminished, but somehow this feels appropriate for a journey toward humility. The desert heat makes armor feel like portable ovens designed by someone with a particularly cruel sense of humor. Metal that protected you from English rain now conducts Palestinian sun directly into your bones, cooking you slowly as you march toward Jerusalem through landscape that looks nothing like the illuminated manuscripts back home. The Holy Land, it turns out, is considerably more holy than land, mostly consisting of rocks, sand, and thorns that seem personally offended by your presence. Arabic numbers prove more useful than European mathematics when calculating supplies, for armies that eat more than they fight. You learn to count in languages you can't speak, to bargain in markets where your money is worth less than your steel, to navigate by stars that shine in patterns unfamiliar to eyes trained on northern skies. The East teaches lessons that weren't included in papal instructions, practical education in survival that makes theology seem like luxury thinking. Cities change hands like playing cards in a very expensive game where everyone cheats and nobody wins for long. Jerusalem falls, is lost, is recaptured, is lost again, each conquest celebrated with religious services that praise the same God worshipped by the people who held it the week before. Walls are rebuilt by the same hands that tore them down, stones recycled through centuries of holy wars that begin to seem suspiciously unholy as the body count rises. Letters home never arrive, carried by messengers who disappear into landscapes that swallow armies whole. Your family receives silence instead of stories, absence instead of reassurance. Meanwhile, you learn Arabic phrases for please and thank you and where is the nearest well, discovering that courtesy translates more easily than conquest. The language of survival proves more useful than the language of war. Saladin's courtesy confuses crusaders trained to expect barbarian savagery, his diplomatic gifts and military honor creating cognitive dissonance that no papal bull prepared you for. The enemy, it turns out, reads philosophy, practices medicine, and treats prisoners better than Christians treat each other. This information doesn't fit comfortable narratives about holy war, but war rarely asks permission before complicating itself. Spice markets in captured cities smell like paradise and commerce combined, cinnamon and cardamom creating olfactory bridges between enemy cultures. You discover flavors that make European food taste like penance, recipes that travel home in the packs of returning crusaders who've learned that some conquests happen through cooking rather than killing. Turmeric proves more lasting than triumph, surviving long after territorial gains evaporate. The strange friendship of shared exhaustion develops between warriors who spend more time marching than fighting, more time hungry than fed, more time lost than found. Enemy soldiers begin to seem less foreign than the political machinations back home, their suffering recognizable even when their language isn't. Humanity, it turns out, translates perfectly across religious and cultural boundaries, requiring no interpreters. Medical knowledge flows both directions across battle lines, Islamic physicians teaching European barber surgeons techniques that save more lives than faith alone manages. Surgical instruments designed in Baghdad hospitals find their way into Crusader medical kits, proving that healing, unlike conquest, improves through cultural exchange. Science serves God more effectively than swords, though this lesson takes centuries to fully absorb. Maps drawn by people who've never been where you're going prove spectacularly unreliable, forcing crusaders to navigate by asking directions from locals who may or may not be providing accurate information. Geography becomes theology as you discover that the Earth is both larger and smaller than European assumptions suggested, filled with peoples and places that don't appear in any biblical atlas. The world, it turns out, has been busy existing without European permission. You go to spread Christianity and come home with Muslim mathematics, architectural techniques that will revolutionize European cathedral building, and stories that make your village sound very small indeed. The Crusades succeed brilliantly at everything except their stated objectives, creating cultural exchange through military failure, building bridges through attempting to build walls. Conquest becomes conversation, though this wasn't exactly the plan. Wars end, but recipes endure. Returning crusaders carry culinary souvenirs that outlast territorial gains, importing Eastern cooking techniques that survive long after political arrangements collapse. Sugar, once rare as salvation, becomes common as prayer in European kitchens. The most lasting victories happen in markets and monasteries rather than on battlefields, though history books won't acknowledge this for centuries. Turns out swords are expensive, but Silk Roads pay for themselves. The Crusades accidentally created the medieval equivalent of frequent flyer programs, establishing trade relationships that survive long after religious enthusiasm fades. Merchants discover that profit proves more durable than piety, business, partnerships, more reliable than military alliances. Commerce flows along routes carved by armies, filling channels dug by conflict with streams of silk, spices and silver. Caravans move like slow rivers across continents, carrying goods that transform from necessity to luxury simply by traveling far enough from home. Venetian glass becomes miraculous in Moscow, Chinese silk divine in London, Indian spices sacred in Stockholm. Distance creates value through the simple alchemy of scarcity, turning common objects into treasures by moving them beyond familiar borders. Geography becomes economy through the patience of pack animals and the stubborn optimism of traders. The Silk Road breathes like a living thing, expanding and contracting with political weather, rerouting around wars like water flowing around stones. Marco Polo's stories sound like lies to European ears accustomed to smaller possibilities. His descriptions of Chinese cities larger than entire European kingdoms, seeming like elaborate fiction designed to sell books to people who've never traveled beyond their local cathedral. But merchants, practical creatures, investigate lies that might contain profitable truths. Ledger books written in 6 languages become the medieval internet, carrying information faster than governments and more accurately than gossip. Banking. Houses develop systems for moving money across continents without moving actual coins, creating paper promises that prove more reliable than royal proclamations. Credit flows along trade routes like blood through veins, carrying economic life to distant markets through networks that survive political collapse. Venetian merchant princes build palaces from pepper profits, their wealth measured in spices, that once grew wild in islands most Europeans can't locate on maps that probably don't show them anyway. The Spice Islands exist in European imagination as combination paradise and treasure chest, places where ordinary trees grow pods worth more than gold, where the air itself smells like prosperity. Nutmeg costs more per pound than silver, making grocery shopping an act of international finance. Letters of credit make trust portable, transforming reputation into currency that travels lighter than actual coins. Florentine banking houses honor promises made in Constantinople. Genoese traders accept Flemish IOUs, creating financial networks that span more territory than any empire and prove more durable than most. Commerce creates its own diplomacy. Business. Relationships that survive political upheavals, because profit, unlike politics, requires actual cooperation. Hanseatic League cities string across northern Europe like pearls on commercial thread, each port connected to others by shared interest in moving goods efficiently rather than conquering territories expensively. Lübeck merchants speak the same language as Bergen traders, not through shared nationality, but through shared spreadsheets, understanding each other perfectly when discussing shipping schedules, warehouse capacity, and profit margins. Ships creak under the weight of distant desires, holds packed with items that exist purely because people in different places want different things. Chinese porcelain travels west, while European wool travels east, each cargo creating demand for return trips, carrying different treasures. Trade becomes circular through the simple recognition that everyone, everywhere, produces something that someone, somewhere else, desperately wants. Guild halls where handshakes seal deals, worth kingdoms develop elaborate rituals around the basic human need to trust strangers with valuable things. Merchant codes of conduct emerge from practical necessity rather than moral philosophy, creating business ethics that work because cheating customers in Hamburg makes trading in Hamburg impossible. Reputation becomes currency more valuable than actual currency, traveling faster than ships and lasting longer than profits. Warehouse districts smell like the entire world concentrated into a few square blocks. Cinnamon mixed with saltfish, leather mixed with silk. The accumulated aromas of global commerce stored in buildings that represent more international cooperation than most diplomatic treaties achieve. Inventory lists read like poetry written in different languages, each entry representing months of travel, risk, and hope that people will pay good money for things they can't produce themselves. Italian pasta meets Chinese noodles in markets, where nobody asks awkward questions about cultural origins. Food evolving through contact in ways that make ethnographers weep and cooks rejoice. Recipes travel faster than the people who created them, adapting to local ingredients and tastes until original sources become academic questions rather than practical concerns. Cooking becomes archaeology, each dish carrying traces of its journey across continents and cultures. Arabic numerals revolutionize European bookkeeping by making mathematics possible for people whose previous counting systems topped out somewhere around many. Double-entry bookkeeping, imported from Islamic commercial practices, transforms European business from elaborate guesswork into something approaching science. Numbers become international language more universal than Latin, more practical than prayer. Banking houses that begin as money-changing booths in market squares evolve into financial institutions that fund kingdoms, finance crusades, and bankroll cathedral construction through the simple realization that lending money to people who can pay it back proves more profitable than storing coins in vaults. Interest rates become theological questions as Christianity wrestles with the practical reality that commerce requires credit, and credit requires compensation for risk. You discover that everyone, everywhere, wants the same things. Something beautiful to brighten ordinary days, something rare to demonstrate status, and something that proves they matter to someone who lives far enough away to be impressive. Human nature proves remarkably consistent across cultures, creating market demand that transcends religious differences, political boundaries, and linguistic barriers. Commerce succeeds where diplomacy fails by appealing to universal human vanity. 1,000 years after Rome fell, you've accidentally built something bigger. Medieval Europe sprawls across the continent like a tapestry woven from threads that shouldn't work together but somehow do. Viking commerce mixed with Roman law, Islamic science blended with Christian theology, Germanic engineering supporting Mediterranean aesthetics. The pattern emerges slowly, visible only from the distance of centuries. But by 1400, you've created civilization version 2.0 without meaning to. Universities bloom in cathedral towns like intellectual mushrooms after rain, growing from monastic schools that got too curious for their own good. Paris, Oxford, Bologna become magnets for minds that ask dangerous questions about Aristotle, Augustine, and whether God really needs this much explaining. Students riot over academic freedom and beer prices in equal measure, establishing traditions that will survive longer than most kingdoms. Knowledge becomes commodity, traded in Latin across borders that barely matter to ideas. Scholastic philosophers attempt to reconcile reason with revelation, creating intellectual gymnastics that would impress Chinese acrobats. Thomas Aquinas builds theological systems so elaborate they require their own architecture. Arguments constructed like cathedrals with foundations in logic and spires reaching toward divine mystery. University debates rage over questions that sound like academic dancing about the sex of angels, but these arguments establish methods of thinking that will eventually remake the world. Gothic cathedrals reach higher than Roman engineering thought possible, their flying buttresses and pointed arches defying gravity through mathematical principles that nobody fully understands but everyone trusts. Architects become theologians working in stone, creating spaces that lift hearts by lifting eyes toward heaven. The technology exists decades before the theory, practical spirituality that builds upward by faith, reinforced with precisely calculated stress distributions. Legal systems struggle to balance God's law with human needs, creating courts that try to serve both divine justice and practical governance. Canon law competes with civil law. Roman precedent argues with Christian principle, while merchants demand commercial codes that actually help business rather than serve abstract ideals. Justice becomes negotiation between competing systems of authority, each claiming divine sanction for entirely practical conclusions. Cities smell like prosperity and sewage in equal measure, urban planning being several centuries away from invention. London, Paris, Florence grow organically like coral reefs, adding new quarters without overall design, creating maze-like street patterns that survive because nobody has authority to impose better ones. Population density creates both opportunity and disease, wealth and poverty existing within walking distance of each other, sometimes within the same building. Guilds regulate everything from bread baking to cathedral construction, creating quality control through the revolutionary concept that people who do the work might know how to do it properly. Master craftsmen guard trade secrets like state secrets, passing knowledge through apprenticeship systems that ensure skills survive even when individual artisans don't. Medieval quality control happens through reputation rather than regulation, social pressure proving more effective than government oversight. The printing press lurks just beyond the horizon, like dawn before sunrise. Gutenberg's experiments with movable type, preparing to revolutionize everything that depends on written words. Books exist in single copies created by monks who think copying text by hand builds character, unaware that their profession has about 50 years left before becoming obsolete. Information wants to be free, but first, it needs to become affordable. Ocean. Voyages begin extending European imagination beyond Mediterranean boundaries. Portuguese sailors discovering that Africa continues much farther south than anyone expected. Spanish explorers convinced they can reach Asia by sailing west into what appears to be empty ocean. Maps admit ignorance by marking unknown territories with "Here be dragons," honest confusion being more helpful than confident mistakes. Scientific method develops in monastery laboratories, where alchemists accidentally discover chemistry while looking for ways to turn lead into gold. Roger Bacon advocates for experimental observation over pure reasoning, suggesting the radical idea that testing theories might prove more reliable than just thinking about them very hard. Natural philosophy begins its slow evolution toward actual science through trial and error that emphasizes error as learning opportunity rather than moral failure. Art begins showing real human faces instead of symbolic representations. Painters, discovering that portraying individuals rather than types creates more interesting pictures. Giotto's figures have weight and personality, occupying space in ways that make viewers feel like they're looking through windows rather than at decorated walls. Perspective becomes both artistic technique and philosophical statement about the relationship between observer and observed. Music notation allows compositions to survive their composers, creating the possibility of musical literature that can be performed centuries after creation. Polyphony develops from experimental curiosity into sophisticated art form. Multiple melodic lines weaving together in mathematical relationships that please both ears and minds. Sound becomes architecture, built from time rather than stone. Structures that exist only while being performed, but can be rebuilt from written instructions. Mechanical clocks begin measuring time with precision that makes scheduling possible, dividing days into hours that mean the same thing everywhere, rather than varying with season and location. Time becomes commodity that can be saved, spent, and wasted, fundamentally changing human relationship with duration. Work shifts from until finished to until time expires, efficiency becoming measurable through standardized temporal units. You're standing at the edge of modernity without knowing it yet. Medieval synthesis, creating conditions for changes that will make medieval civilization unrecognizable within a few generations. The Renaissance waits just around the historical corner. Humanism preparing to challenge medieval assumptions about authority, individualism, and the relationship between earthly and divine concerns. But for now, you're building the future with tools borrowed from the past, creating tomorrow through the accumulated weight of yesterday's decisions. She was born to ledger books and linen, raised on stories of distant cities told in her father's warehouse, where bales of wool smelled like sheep and rain, where account books recorded debts in 3 currencies and hope in several more. Margherita Dottini learned numbers before letters, understanding profit margins before poetry, growing up bilingual in commerce and dreams among merchants who traded in both silk and possibility. Her childhood unfolded between warehouse and counting house, playing hide and seek among bolts of fabric imported from Flanders, while clerks calculated exchange rates between Florentine florins and English pounds. The sounds of her youth were ledger pages turning, coins counting, and her father's voice discussing shipping schedules with captains whose ships carried everything from wool to wonder across Mediterranean waters that connected Italian prosperity to European demand. Marriage contracts were negotiated like trade agreements, her dowry calculated in property, connections, and commercial opportunity rather than mere affection. Francesco Dattini, successful merchant 20 years her senior, offered partnership in both business and bed. Their relationship built on mutual advantage that slowly ripened into something approaching love. Medieval marriage, she discovered, worked best when friendship preceded romance, when shared goals created intimacy more lasting than physical attraction. Managing household became managing business when plague took half the workforce, and surviving employees demanded wages that reflected their sudden scarcity. She learned to negotiate with suppliers who assumed women understood nothing beyond needlework, to balance books that recorded both profit and loss in human terms, to make decisions that affected dozens of families while maintaining feminine propriety that men expected even from women doing masculine work. The Black Death changed everything about how people loved and planned, killing perhaps a third of Europe's population while teaching survivors that life, always precarious, had become completely unpredictable. Margarita's letters to her traveling husband carried undertones of desperate affection, mixed with practical updates about business operations, each message potentially their last communication if plague reached either sender or recipient before words could travel. Her correspondence reveals medieval woman's inner life, preserved in careful script. Letters that discuss wool prices and spiritual concerns with equal attention, mixing commercial details with personal longing in ways that make business intimate and intimacy businesslike. She worried about his health during dangerous journeys, managed household finances during his absences, and maintained family reputation while adapting to circumstances that required constant improvisation. Women running businesses appeared throughout medieval Europe whenever men traveled, died, or proved incompetent, though history books typically credited their husbands, fathers, or sons for accomplishments achieved through female management. Margarita joined invisible army of merchant wives, widows and daughters who kept commerce functioning while official records ignored their contributions, their competence surviving in account books rather than chronicles. Plague years taught lessons about human resilience that no university curriculum included, showing that survival required flexibility more than planning, adaptation more than authority. She watched families disappear overnight while others prospered through chance as much as skill, learning that success in plague time meant staying alive rather than getting rich, though getting rich helped with staying alive when wealth could buy safety unavailable to the poor. Her letters describe daily life that mixed luxury with uncertainty, households that enjoyed imported spices while fearing imported diseases, lives that were simultaneously more comfortable and more dangerous than anything modern people experience. She lived better than royalty from earlier centuries while facing mortality rates that make medieval existence seem like extended gambling with death as the house that always won eventually. Religious faith provided framework for understanding. Suffering that otherwise made no sense, plague interpreted as divine punishment that somehow served divine purpose, even when purpose remained invisible to human understanding. She attended masses that asked for deliverance while accepting that God's plan might include comprehensive destruction. Faith that found meaning in meaninglessness through the assumption that human understanding was simply inadequate to grasp divine logic. Business ethics evolved from practical necessity rather than theoretical principle. Merchant codes developing because cheating customers in plague years meant having no customers next year, if there was a next year. She learned to balance profit with survival, understanding that reputation traveled faster than disease and lasted longer than temporary advantage gained through dishonest dealing. Her textile business connected northern European sheep to southern European looms through commercial networks that survived political upheaval, plague, and war by serving needs that transcended national boundaries. Wool grown in English pastures became cloth woven in Flemish workshops, sold in Italian markets, shipped to customers throughout Mediterranean world that functioned as economic unit despite political fragmentation. The peculiar intimacy of surviving disaster together bonded commercial partners across cultural and religious boundaries. Muslim merchants in Spain, corresponding with Christian partners in Italy, through shared understanding that business required trust more fundamental than theological agreement. Trade created relationships that outlasted political arrangements, economic cooperation proving more durable than military alliances. Her account books record transformation of medieval economy from local subsistence to international commerce, showing how individual transactions accumulated into systemic change that nobody planned but everyone participated in. Each sale, each purchase, each credit arrangement contributed to commercial revolution that connected European villages to Asian spice islands through chains of mutual dependence. Daily life combined routine domestic tasks with international finance, Margarita checking inventory while dinner cooked, reviewing correspondence from distant partners while supervising household servants, balancing books that recorded transactions, spanning continents, while managing relationships that barely spanned city blocks. Medieval women's work included everything from childcare to commodity speculation, domestic duties expanding to encompass global commerce. Her letters survive while her wool turned to dust. Personal correspondence outlasting commercial records, because human connection proves more durable than business transaction. She wrote about love, loss, hope, and fear in ways that make 14th century emotions immediately recognizable to 21st century readers, proving that human hearts change more slowly than human circumstances. The roots she helped establish still carry goods across continents 6 centuries later. Medieval trade networks evolving into modern supply chains through continuous adaptation to changing political, technological, and economic conditions. Her commercial legacy survives in infrastructure that connects global markets, though her name appears in no history books that discuss international trade. His hands were stained blue from lapis lazuli ground to powder finer than flour, gold, from leaf that cost more than most peasants earned in lifetimes, and red from cinnabar that travelled further than most pilgrims to reach his work table in Canterbury's scriptorial, where morning lights slanted through windows designed to serve beauty, rather than mere illumination. Brother Thomas worked in colours worth kingdoms, creating art that would outlast empires through the patient application of precious pigments to vellum pages that transformed sheepskin into sacred space. Dawn prayers preceded careful brushstrokes. By mere minutes, Thomas moving from chapel to scriptorium like a monk, transitioning between different forms of worship, devotional practice that included both spoken prayer and visual praise. His illuminated manuscripts served God through beauty that made sacred texts literally luminous. Each decorated initial letter a tiny cathedral where divine light could enter human consciousness through eyes trained to see heaven in carefully applied color. The mathematics of beauty governed his work through proportions that connected earthly craftsmanship to celestial harmony. Golden ratios appearing in margin decorations that seemed spontaneous but followed geometric principles that made chaos into cosmos. Angels danced in borders according to rules that balanced asymmetry with proportion, creating visual music that sang to viewers who understood that true art served both aesthetic pleasure and spiritual instruction. Mixing colors required knowledge that combined chemistry with theology, each pigment carrying symbolic meaning as well as visual impact. Blue represented heaven's infinite expanse, requiring lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan at costs that made every stroke precious. Gold symbolized divine light made visible, applied in leaf so thin that breathing could destroy hours of work. Red signified both martyrdom and love, cinnabar providing intensity that seemed to glow from within the page itself, his eyes strained by candlelight that flickered like his concentration. Thomas worked through winter afternoons when daylight failed before devotion did, continuing by flame illumination that added warmth to colors already saturated with meaning. Each letter took hours to complete, complex initials requiring days of detailed work that tested both patience and faith through repetitive precision that transformed labor into meditation. Vellum preparation consumed weeks before any actual illumination began. Animal skins treated through processes that turned death into foundation for eternal beauty. Sheep and calves provided material for books that would preserve knowledge longer than the animals had lived. Sacrifice transformed into service through craftsmanship that honored both creature and creator through the quality of work performed upon transformed flesh. Anonymous artistry characterized monastic illumination. Individual creativity hidden behind religious service that credited God rather than human talent for beauty, that obviously required both divine inspiration and human skill. Thomas signed nothing, claimed nothing, allowed his work to speak without identification, understanding that true service meant disappearing into what was served rather than claiming credit for cooperation with grace. The tension between artistic vision and religious duty created creative challenges that pushed illumination toward innovations that served both aesthetic and spiritual purposes. Margins became playgrounds where imagination could exercise without compromising textual accuracy, decorative elements that enhanced rather than distracted from sacred content. Art served scripture by making it more beautiful, more memorable, more capable of capturing attention that wandered during purely textual presentations. Monasteries functioned as medieval art schools, where knowledge transferred through apprenticeship systems that preserved techniques across generations of scribes, who learned by copying masters until competence enabled creativity. Thomas had learned from Brother William, who learned from Brother Augustine, creating chains of artistic inheritance that connected contemporary work to traditions stretching back to Irish monks who first decorated sacred texts with patterns that transformed reading into visual experience. Books under construction resembled architectural projects that required months or years to complete. Complex manuscripts involving teams of scribes, illuminators, and binders whose coordinated efforts produced objects that were simultaneously utilitarian and artistic. Thomas worked on texts that would serve practical religious needs while providing aesthetic experiences that justified their enormous cost through beauty that seemed to justify its own existence. The transition from purely symbolic to subtly realistic art appeared gradually in illuminated manuscripts as artists discovered that showing recognizable human faces made biblical narratives more engaging than purely abstract representations. Thomas painted angels with features that suggested individual personalities rather than generic sanctity. Saints whose expressions conveyed specific emotions rather than symbolic attitudes, beginning artistic revolution that would eventually produce Renaissance portraiture. His workshop contained tools that connected him to traditions extending back to Egyptian scribes, who first learned to preserve words in permanent form, brushes and quills that represented technological continuity across millennia of human attempts to capture thought in visible form. Writing implements changed slowly, each generation adding small improvements to basic techniques that served literacy from ancient Alexandria to medieval Canterbury. Color symbolism carried meanings that modern viewers miss completely. Medieval audiences understanding that specific hues conveyed theological messages as precisely as written words. Thomas painted Virgin Mary's robes in blue that proclaimed her connection to heaven, Christ's garments in purple that announced royal authority, saints' halos in gold that declared their participation in divine light. Visual theology spoke through pigments to congregations that might not read text, but could certainly interpret color. Preservation motivated illumination as much as decoration. beautiful books receiving better care than purely functional manuscripts. Aesthetic value, creating practical protection for information that might otherwise be lost to neglect, fire, or simple indifference. Beauty served preservation by making objects precious enough to protect, ensuring survival through attractiveness that made destruction seem like sacrilege. His illuminated psalters accompanied medieval Christians through private devotions that supplemented public worship, portable beauty that made personal prayer more engaging than simple recitation. Handheld books created intimate relationships between individual believers and sacred texts. Illumination providing visual focus for meditation that might otherwise drift during purely mental prayer exercises. Knowledge preservation happened through beauty because beautiful things endured when useful things were discarded. Aesthetic value providing insurance against historical amnesia that claimed most medieval artifacts. Thomas created objects designed to last forever through visual appeal that made destruction emotionally difficult, even for people who couldn't read the text being preserved within illuminated borders. Individual creativity survived within anonymous, religious service through decorative elements that revealed personality despite institutional suppression of individual recognition. Thomas's marginal creatures displayed humor. His angel faces showed individual character. His color choices reflected personal aesthetic preferences that created recognizable style even without signature identification, artistic personality asserting itself through choices that claimed no credit while declaring unmistakable presence. 500 years later, children still trace the curves of his letters with wondering fingers, medieval craftsmanship speaking across centuries to viewers who understand beauty intuitively even when historical context remains mysterious. Proof that some forms of communication transcend temporal boundaries through direct appeal to human appreciation for work that serves both function and form with equal devotion. She had walked 3,000 miles to touch a stone, and now she was walking 3,000 miles home, carrying stories heavier than her pack, and memories that weighed more than the silver shrine badges sewn to her cloak, like medals earned through suffering. Eleanor of Wessex returned from Santiago de Compostela, transformed by journey more than destination, pilgrimage having taught lessons that no cathedral could contain about distance, faith, and the strange intimacy that develops between strangers, who share roads that lead everywhere, except back to who you used to be. The outbound journey began with prayers and blisters in equal measure, her leather shoes proving inadequate for roads that stretched across kingdoms whose names she couldn't pronounce in languages she couldn't speak. Pilgrimage routes worn smooth by millions of hopeful feet connected village to village, like rosary beads strung across Europe. Each stopping point marking another day survived, another mile conquered, another small victory over the simple human tendency to stay home where familiar hardships felt manageable. Compostela Cathedral materialized from morning mist, like prayer made visible, its towers reaching toward heaven from earth that felt sacred, mainly because walking to it had cost everything she owned except hope. The Shrine of St. James drew pilgrims like iron filings to lodestone, magnetic pull that operated through faith rather than physics, attracting believers who needed to believe that walking could somehow earn what prayer alone couldn't purchase. But the return journey carried different weight entirely. Outbound hope replaced by inbound wisdom that made familiar landscape look foreign to eyes that had seen too much to return unchanged. She carried stories that grew with each telling, experiences that transformed through repetition, until memory and imagination blended into truth more meaningful than mere accuracy. Pilgrimage becoming narrative that improved through performance. Languages, learned through necessity rather than formal education, created connections that survived linguistic barriers. Essential phrases for food, shelter, and mercy proving more useful than theological discussions that assumed shared vocabulary. She discovered that hunger, thirst, and exhaustion translated perfectly across cultural boundaries, human need creating universal grammar that required no formal instruction. basic survival, generating fluency in communication that transcended national differences. Roadside inns collected recipes like libraries collected manuscripts, cooking techniques traveling from kitchen to kitchen along pilgrimage routes that connected regional cuisines through the practical need to feed travelers whose stomachs had learned to appreciate variety that home cooking couldn't provide. She returned with knowledge of Spanish saffron, French bread, and German sausage, culinary education that enriched her table long after spiritual benefits faded into ordinary routine. The way travel changed what home meant became apparent only after returning to places that looked smaller than memory suggested. Village boundaries that seemed confining after months of unlimited horizons, familiar faces that couldn't understand, experiences that existed beyond their imaginative reach. Home had shrunk while she expanded, creating displacement that made belonging complicated for someone who had learned that the world contained more possibilities than any single location could encompass. Faith tested by cold nights and empty stomachs proved more durable than comfortable belief that had never faced serious challenge. Pilgrimage serving as spiritual stress test that revealed which aspects of devotion survived practical hardship. She learned to pray while walking, to find God in strangers' kindness, to discover that sacred space existed wherever need met generosity, rather than only in designated holy places marked by architectural grandeur. Humanity discovered in shared suffering created bonds stronger than family ties, fellow pilgrims becoming temporary siblings united by common purpose that transcended social distinctions maintained at home. Merchants walked beside peasants. Nobles shared bread with commoners, creating temporary equality that pilgrimage routes imposed on travelers who needed each other more than they needed class distinctions that mattered less when everyone's feet hurt equally. The realization that journey was always the destination emerged gradually, understanding that arrival provided less transformation than the process of getting there, pilgrimage working its changes through accumulated miles rather than final moments at shrine. Walking taught lessons that touching stones couldn't provide. Physical movement creating spiritual motion that happened during travel, rather than upon arrival at officially designated sacred destinations. Coming home as different person to place. That hadn't changed, created adjustment challenges that nobody had warned her about. Reverse culture shock that made familiar customs seem strange to someone who had learned that normal was relative rather than absolute. She struggled to care about village gossip after witnessing international diversity, local concerns seeming trivial compared to universal human experiences encountered during months on roads that connected everything to everything else. Her stories grew in the telling, experiences expanding through repetition until fact blended with interpretation, memory enhanced by imagination that served truth more faithfully than strict accuracy could manage. Pilgrimage became performance art, narrative that improved through editing, personal history that gained meaning through creative embellishment that honored experience more effectively than documentary precision. The maps in her mind proved more accurate than any cartographer's chart, internal geography that recorded not just physical distances, but emotional territories crossed during journey that measured progress in changed perspectives rather than mere miles covered. She navigated by memory of kindness received, routes marked by generosity encountered, directions determined by humanity discovered rather than compass readings or written instructions. Religious souvenirs carried significance that transcended their commercial value. Shrine badges and blessed medals, serving as tangible proof of intangible transformation. Physical objects that represented spiritual journey in ways that made pilgrimage real to people who hadn't shared the experience. She wore evidence of faith that had been tested and strengthened through trials that comfortable devotion never encountered. Cultural exchange happened through involuntary immersion in differences that challenged assumptions about how life should be lived. Pilgrimage routes serving as medieval cultural university where curriculum consisted of daily survival among people whose customs initially seemed incomprehensible. but gradually revealed underlying human logic. She learned that strange wasn't wrong, just different. Unfamiliar wasn't threatening, just educational. The weight of perspective gained through seeing how other people lived made provincial concerns seem smaller without making them less important. Expanding context that allowed local problems to maintain significance while losing their appearance of cosmic importance. She cared about village issues differently after learning that villages existed everywhere, each thinking itself central to a universe that actually centered nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Letters written during pilgrimage preserved experiences that memory alone couldn't maintain accurately. Written record that captured immediate reactions before distance transformed them into stories. Raw experience recorded before editing made it suitable for sharing with people who hadn't earned the right to unfiltered truth through shared suffering. Her correspondence revealed pilgrimage's reality behind pilgrimage's romance. Integration challenges faced every returning pilgrim who had to reconcile transformation with unchanged circumstances. Personal evolution that had to function within social structures that remained static during individual journey. She discovered that changing yourself was easier than changing your situation. Internal pilgrimage continuing long after physical journey ended. Spiritual travel requiring no roads except those that existed within consciousness. The recognition that everyone was on pilgrimage, whether they acknowledged it or not, emerged from understanding gained through intentional journey. Life itself revealed a series of destinations that mattered less than quality of travel between them. She saw neighbors differently after learning that movement towards something better constituted universal human activity. Everyone seeking improvement through methods that varied but shared fundamental hope. She brought back more than she carried, away, returning with expanded capacity for understanding that made room for experiences that wouldn't fit in original worldview. Consciousness enlarged through contact with differences that had initially seemed threatening but proved enriching. Pilgrimage worked by subtraction and addition simultaneously, removing assumptions while adding possibilities, creating space for growth through elimination of limitations that had seemed permanent. And now you drift back to your bed, your time, your quieter century, floating forward through the centuries like a leaf carried by gentle current. Medieval dreams dissolving into modern comfort as consciousness returns to familiar surroundings that suddenly seem impossibly luxurious. Central heating, electric lights, running water, antibiotics, comfortable mattresses, reliable food supply. Miracles that would have seemed like magic to Eleanor, Thomas, Margarita, and millions of ancestors who lived entire lives without. Experiencing comfort that you take for granted every single night. The sensation of moving forward through time feels like rising through warm water. Historical weightlifting gradually as you surface from deep past into present moment, where your breathing slows naturally, where your pillow cradles head that has temporarily held memories of stone floors and straw bedding, where your blankets provide warmth that medieval fireplaces could never quite deliver. Time travel, it turns out, works best in reverse, returning always easier than departing, coming home more comfortable than leaving. Medieval dreams fade like morning mist, but traces linger in consciousness that has been temporarily expanded to accommodate experiences that your own life couldn't provide directly. Understanding borrowed from people who lived through centuries that seem both impossibly distant and surprisingly familiar. Human concerns remain remarkably consistent across time. Love, safety, meaning, comfort, connection, hope that tomorrow might improve upon today through effort that seems worth making despite uncertain outcomes. The continuity between ancient rest and current sleep becomes apparent as your body settles into rhythms that connect you to every person who has ever sought peace at day's end, who has ever pulled covers closer while darkness gathered, who has ever closed eyes hoping that sleep would provide restoration that waking hours sometimes fail to deliver. Sleep, humanity's most democratic experience, belongs equally to peasants and kings, to medieval pilgrims and modern insomniacs. They slept, you sleep, Tomorrow, someone else will sleep in beds not yet built, under roofs not yet constructed, in cities not yet founded, carrying concerns not yet imagined, but fundamentally similar to worries that kept Romans awake, that disturbed medieval rest, that follow you into dreams that connect all sleeping minds across centuries through shared vulnerability that makes consciousness temporary and rest eternal. History reveals itself as millions of individual bedtimes, accumulating into narrative. That seems grand from distance, but consisted mainly of ordinary people dealing with ordinary problems using extraordinary persistence, each generation believing their challenges unique, while facing variations on universal themes that make past struggles recognizable to present experience. Your ancestors survived plagues, wars, famines, and uncertainties that make current difficulties seem manageable by comparison. The shared experience of listening creates temporary community that spans continents and time zones, invisible connections forming between strangers who seek similar comfort, in stories that make solitude feel less isolated, insomnia less personal, restlessness less unique. Somewhere, always, someone else lies awake seeking peace that history might provide, through reminder that human struggles continue, but so does human endurance, that every problem has been survived by someone. Recognition of global community of late-night thinkers and early morning warriors provides comfort that transcends geographical boundaries, darkness connecting minds that daylight separates, night creating intimacy between strangers who share need for gentle stories that make sleeping possible when consciousness insists on remaining active. You're not alone in wakefulness that feels isolating, but actually connects you to everyone who has ever stared at ceiling while seeking rest. The comfort of knowing others are awake in darkness, seeking same peace that you pursue, creates solidarity that requires no formal organization, no membership, no commitment beyond shared recognition that sleep sometimes needs assistance from stories that provide what counting sheep cannot deliver. Midnight connects Tokyo to London to New York through shared experience of seeking rest, that daylight makes seem unnecessary, but darkness reveals as essential. History becomes lullaby, sung by generations to generations, ancestors providing comfort, to descendants through accumulated wisdom that says, "We survived, you exist, survival continues, problems pass, rest comes eventually. Tomorrow offers possibilities that worry obscures, but sleep might reveal." The dead offer advice through their persistence in living until death, through their determination to keep trying until trying became unnecessary. Permission to rest comes from understanding that others have carried the world before you, that your shoulders needn't bear weight that previous generations have already lifted, that current responsibility can be shared with past experience through recognition that every challenge has historical precedent, that someone survived long enough to produce you. Your existence proves that someone, somewhere, somehow made it work well enough to continue. Your ancestors survived ice ages and plagues, invasions and famines, political upheavals and natural disasters, personal losses, and collective tragedies. That would have ended everything if anyone had given up completely, but they didn't give up. They kept going. They found ways to continue that produce the continuation that includes you lying here now, breathing steadily, heart beating reliably, consciousness capable of rest because others maintained consciousness. When rest seemed impossible, the accumulated weight of human persistence provides foundations strong enough to support your temporary rest. Civilizations sturdy enough to survive your brief unconsciousness. History reliable enough to continue while you sleep. You can rest because the world will keep turning. People will keep working. Stories will keep being told. Tomorrow will arrive whether you worry about it or not. Sleep now, while others maintain the watch that consciousness requires. While night shift, workers and early risers, insomniacs and different time zones provide coverage that allows your awareness to fade without abandoning responsibility. The world has been managed by sleeping people for centuries. civilization, continuing through collective unconsciousness that somehow maintains what individual wakefulness cannot sustain alone. The stories will wait, patient as stones, ready to resume whenever consciousness returns, seeking entertainment or comfort, or simple distraction from thoughts that circle like worried birds around concerns that sleep might resolve more effectively than thinking. Stories exist in timeless patience, available always but never demanding attention that belongs to rest when rest becomes possible. They always do wait, stories, eternal as human need for narrative that makes sense of experience, that often makes no sense, meaning created through telling and retelling that transforms confusion into understanding, isolation into connection, restlessness into peace that arrives finally, gently, like dawn after long night, like sleep after longer wakefulness, like home after longest journey. Sleep now, sleep well, sleep deep. The stories will be here when you wake, if you wake, when you're ready, if you need them. Until then, rest in the knowledge that you're part of continuation that began before you arrived and will continue after you leave. Temporary consciousness, briefly aware of eternal story that includes your dreaming as essential chapter in narrative that never ends, only pauses, breathing softly, like you, now, finally, at rest.